We can do hard things. This is one of the favorite phrases of Glennon Doyle, the well-known Christian mommy blogger turned best-selling self-help author. She's best-selling for a reason. She's in recovery from alcohol addiction. She manages an eating disorder. She's been incredibly vulnerable about her difficult marriage to a good man that ended, and the beginning of an entirely different relationship and marriage to a woman. She writes about all this in a very raw and authentic way. I got to know more about Glennon because the woman she married is Abby Wambach. And you might know her as one of the most famous American soccer players, maybe ever. And you all know that I am kind of obsessed with soccer. So I took note when that happened. And what you don't know is that my wife, on the other hand, had a long phase of being obsessed with Christian mommy bloggers. So she was very familiar with Glennon pre-Abby. So when they got together, it was like our worlds aligned. But honestly, that's a little beside the point. The point is, Glennon has done hard things. She's overcome. And what's beautiful about her story is, as she's overcome, she's continually widened her perspective of hard things. It started with herself, but once she got a handle on her individual struggles, when she really started to blossom into who God made her to be, she looked beyond herself to the things around her. She started a nonprofit called Together Rising that quickly mobilizes whenever there's struggle in the world. This month, Together Rising raised over $100,000 for people in Texas. They've supported refugees in Greece, built a maternity ward in Haiti, and helped abandoned kids on the street in Indianapolis. We can do hard things, Glennon says over and over again. And then she goes out and does hard things, and she gets other people to do hard things with her, which implies that it is worth it to do hard things, that there's a way of life so profound that we are called to do hard things to find it, that there's a love that is so important that we are called to do hard things to live it. We can do hard things, and we must do hard things. I think that's exactly what Jesus is saying in today's gospel from Mark. There are certain hard things that our culture celebrates, and rightfully so. Just this week, NASA landed a rover on Mars that has a working helicopter attached to it. Mars is 135 million miles away. The sun is closer, a lot closer, actually. Do you know how much thought and intelligence and collaboration it takes to first create a technologically stunning piece of equipment that can do mind-blowing science remotely? Do you know how hard it is to then send that equipment 135 million miles through space, land it on a frozen planet, and make sure it still works when it gets there? It's incredible. And I'm amazed every time a photo from Mars crosses one of my social media feeds. We can do hard things when we want to. We can send a rover to Mars, but we can't, or perhaps won't, figure out how to pull every single American out of poverty. There is more than enough in America, the richest country on the planet, to house and feed every single person who lives here. It's not a failure of resources. It's a failure of will. It's a failure of love. You've heard me say it before, and I will say it again. Love is the only commandment Jesus ever gave us. Love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. And I think it's tempting to only focus on the love that seems easy, to only focus on Jesus' love through healing, through welcoming the stranger. I know that's not always easy, but it's, one of the nicer ones. Through miraculously feeding 5,000 people with a couple of fish and a few loaves of bread. And don't get me wrong, those ways of love are beautiful and important. But today's gospel brings us to a harder side of love. For the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the good news I bring, which is love, Jesus says, I will be rejected and I will be killed. And Peter doesn't want to hear it. In his mind, Messiahs don't die, they conquer. In his mind, love shouldn't be that hard. Jesus famously shuts him down immediately. Get behind me, Satan, he says. Then he says, that's not how the gospel works. The gospel calls us to live God's love no matter how hard it is. Then Jesus looks out at the gathered crowd and his disciples and he says, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. What are you willing to sacrifice to live the gospel? He asks. How uncomfortable are you willing to get to live the love God calls us to? And let me remind you, this is right after he just said that he was going to be rejected by everyone and killed. Jesus will walk his talk. And I want to be very careful about how we interpret this, because righteous suffering has been used to justify all sorts of injustice and oppression. Instead of attempting to change the situation of people experiencing poverty, there is a temptation to celebrate their suffering as pluckiness, as perseverance. Jesus didn't say that the poor would always be among us because he believed their suffering was righteous. He said the poor would always be among us because he knew that until God's kingdom comes, sin would always be among us. Greed would always be among us. And where there is sin and greed, there is always poverty. Jesus isn't talking about selective righteous suffering, selective discomfort, selective sacrifice. He's not asking some people to do hard things while letting others sit back. No, he said, for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? He's not mincing words. If we seek the profit and comfort of this world over the love that the gospel calls us to, we're not following Jesus. If we're not willing to sacrifice, to get uncomfortable for the sake of God and our neighbor, we're not following Jesus. And I think we'd be surprised to discover what makes us comfortable, what we're not willing to sacrifice. In our culture, the thing we are often most comfortable with is busyness. The thing we are often least willing to sacrifice is productivity. Have you all heard of the nap bishop? Looking around, seeing your faces. See a couple nods. Tricia Hersey is the founder of the Nap Ministry, an organization that advocates for rest as a form of resistance against burnout culture. She's a Black woman whose preaching teaches us how racism is intrinsically connected to our idolization of productivity. I mean, it's not a big leap to make. Just think about slavery, which was all about free and forced labor, which is all about maximum productivity. Racism is the dehumanization of certain bodies because they look different. And viewing bodies solely as means of production is the ultimate dehumanization. The Nat Bishop's church is online. Her Instagram posts preach to me every single day. Exhaustion will not create liberation, one post says. Another says, your obsession with productivity as a function of your worth is preventing you from tending to your soul. Naps are soul care. When our highest value is productivity, we dehumanize ourselves, which is to say, we separate ourselves from God. The Nat Bishop wants us to rest so that we can love the way Jesus calls us to love. Love God, love our neighbor, and love ourselves. Sometimes resting is the hard thing we're called to do. Yes, we are called to show up for our neighbor. Yes, we are called to advocate for justice and dismantle systems of oppression. The law, the prophets, and Jesus all tell us that is how we live our faith. But we can't do that if we're exhausted all the time. Sometimes resting is the hard thing we are called to do. It's what we've committed to as a community this Lent, this gray time of winter rain and hitting pandemic walls, release and respite. So I close with a prayer from the NAP ministry. I wish us all tight hugs, deep eye contact, long naps, warm blankets, and a community that asks the question, how is your heart? And waits and listens for the answer silently. May the ground under us hold up with strength. And if we need to collapse into grief, may a soft pillow be there. Amen.